In the late 11th century BCE, the land faced yet new threats. The Philistines began to take territory away from the tribes. They conquered Judah in the south, then the central hill country and the Jezreel Valley. They were well equipped with chariots. The Israelites were inferior. Finally, Israel attempted to stand up. They brought the ark from the central sanctuary in Shiloh, between Beth-el and Shechem. But near Aphek, around 10 miles east of Jaffa, the Philistines decimated the Israelite army, killing the 2 priests in charge of the ark, capturing the ark itself. They destroyed Shiloh and the sanctuary. The judges were helpless, and the Israelite confederation disintegrated. The judge in those days was Samuel, known to be a seer and a priest, and the founder of Israel's early prophetic movement. He watched with pain as Israel collapsed around him. In his old age, he returned home to Ramah, north of Jerusalem. Yielding to the tribal elders, he reluctantly agreed to find them a king. His name was Saul, son of Kish, whom Samuel found wandering through the hills, looking for his father's donkeys. Samuel, upon encountering him, secretly anointed him. When Samuel later assembled the tribes at Mitzpeh, south of Beth-el, the people acclaimed him. But some anti-monarchists who wanted tribal independence mocked him and left. Even in ancient Israel, there were harsh disputes over centralized government versus a diffuse confederacy. Such lessons were not lost on America's founders as they struggled to find a governmental model for our own republic. Thomas Paine summed it up. The hankering which the Jews had for the idolatrous customs of the heathens is something exceedingly unaccountable. But so it was that, laying hold of the misconduct of Samuel's 2 sons, they came in an abrupt and clamorous manner to Samuel, saying, "Behold, thou art old, and thy sons walk not in thy ways. Now make us a king to judge us like all the other nations." But here we cannot observe but that their motives were bad, for their true glory lay in being as much unlike them as possible. But the thing displeased Samuel, and the Lord said unto Samuel, "Hearken unto the voice of the people in all that they say unto thee, for they have not rejected thee, but they have rejected me, that I should not reign over them." And Samuel told all the words of the Lord unto the people, and asked of him a king. And he said, "This shall be the manner of the king that shall reign over you. He will take your sons and appoint them for himself and for his chariots, and to be his horsemen, and some shall run before his chariots." This description agrees with the present mode of impressing men. "And he will take your fields, your vineyards, your olive yards, even the best of them, and give them to his servants. And he will take the tenth of your seed and of your vineyards, and give them to his officers and to his servants," by which we see that bribery, corruption, and favoritism are the standing vices of kings. and the Lord will not hear you in that day. And this accounts for the continuation of monarchy. In another story, Saul is depicted as a deliverer and judge. Yavesh Gil'ad, Jabesh Gilead, across the Jordan, is besieged by the Ammonites, whose terms for surrender are, all your right eyes shall be put out. Saul, plowing when he hears of it, reacts in charismatic fashion. He cuts his oxen in pieces and sends the pieces to the tribes, declaring, whoever does not follow Saul and Samuel into battle, this shall be done to his cattle. The Ammonites are beaten. The people bring Saul to the shrine in Gilgal, where Joshua once encamped. They acclaim him king around 1220 BCE. Like earlier charismatic leaders, Saul's principal task was to conduct a war of liberation. Saul's successful expedition against the Ammonites at Yabesh Gil'ad was without doubt an important consideration in his selection. Now, he was called upon to lead his people against the Philistines, people who were well organized, well equipped, and motivated by an expansionist ideology that included plans to bring the whole country west of the Jordan under its control. The Philistine War thus became a guerrilla war, characterized by ambushes and surprise attacks against enemy posts. Generally, it didn't involve large numbers of fighters. Saul had only 600 men with him near Gibeah. Unfortunately, the Bible only provides a brief sketch of the details of the continuing war with the Philistines. Saul probably succeeded in driving the Philistines out of the central part of Israel. Along the way, Saul displeases God and the prophet Samuel for failing to slay the king of the Amalekites and for sparing the best of the cattle. Samuel prophesies against him that his kingdom will be taken from him. Odd that this transgression was failing to kill. Many modern commentators indeed have great sympathy for Saul, whose fate only gets worse. The Philistines, for their part, didn't give up. They apparently attacked from the south, threatening Judah in a continuing confrontation in which a young Judahite named David distinguished himself. It's hard to give a balanced historical assessment of Saul's reign. In biblical tradition, he's presented as a typical bad guy, in contrast to his adversary and successor, David. This contrast is the central theme of the stories in 1 Samuel 16 through 27, the bulk of which may well have been written by David's companion and priest, Abiathar, or somebody close to him. These chapters may contain some reliable information, but is presented in a one-sided, pro-David way. David is, of course, hailed and lionized by the biblical text, but some speculate that there are actually two versions of the David story in the Bible, one pro, the other anti, and that the pro-David story wins out because the final editor of the text was one of David's cronies. And nonetheless, if we look carefully beneath the sugarcoating, a rather sinister picture of David emerges. He first appears in Saul's court, the legitimate king having summoned him to play soothing music on his lyre. When the Philistine giant Goliath issues a challenge to fight a single Israelite to determine which side will serve the other, David volunteers and defeats him with his trusty slingshot. But David is just getting started. He gets the people on his side as they chant, "Saul has slain his thousands, David his tens of thousands." David finagles his way into the royal house by asking for Saul's daughter Michal as his reward. Saul begins to suspect that David is plotting what amounts to a coup and starts to lose it. Along the way, the old prophet Samuel secretly anoints David as the new king. That's odd, isn't it? And did God change the divine mind? And by the way, the Hebrew word anoint is mashach, a derivation of which is Mashiach, Messiah. David will be seen as Israel's first and archetypal Messiah. David now flees to the desert of En-Gedi with Saul in hot pursuit. But when David encounters Saul fast asleep in a cave, he spares him, cutting off a corner of his robe and holding it up from a distance. The tortured king is smitten with remorse, announcing, "David, you're a better man than I." Why didn't David go ahead and kill Saul, who, after all, was seeking his death? Could it be that David really was seeking to take the kingdom for himself and knew that his coup had to be squeaky clean, at least look that way? So what does he do? He and his gang of 600 flee to the company of the Philistines, whereupon David feigns madness so that they think him harmless. But shouldn't he be fighting the Philistines, who are, after all, Israel's confirmed enemies? In the end, Saul is left to confront the Philistines on Mount Gilboa, only to fall in battle along with his son Jonathan. Who is left to take the mantle of monarch? Who else but David, called by the Bible a man after God's own heart? But to some critics, he's not anything more than a scheming conniver, perhaps a cross between Machiavelli and Richard Nixon. In any case, David composes a classic dirge over the fallen King Saul and Jonathan, with whom he had made a politically advantageous pact. Hatzvi Yisrael al bamotecha halal, ech naflu giborim, al takidu bagat, al tevasru bechutzot Ashkelon, pen tismachna benot Pelishtim, pen ta'alozna benot ha'arelim, hare Gilboa, al tal ve'al matar alechem, usde trumot, כי שם נגאל מגן גיבורים, מגן שאול, בלי משיח בשמן. מדם חללים, מחלב גיבורים, קשת יהונתן, לא נסוג אחור, וחרב שאול לא תשוב ריקם. שאול ויהונתן, הנאהבים והנעימים בחייהם, ובמותם לא נפרדו. מנשרים כלו, מאריות גברו, איך נפלו גיבורים בתוך המלחמה. יהונתן, על במותיך חלל. צר לי עליך, אחי יהונתן, נעמת לי מאוד, נפלאת אהבתך לי מאהבת נשים. איך נפלו גיבורים, ויעבדו כלי מלחמה. This is great PR. Written from David's viewpoint, the stories in 1 Samuel 16 through 27 tend to depict David as right in rebelling against Saul and in seeking refuge in Philistine territory. But they also reveal that people from Bethlehem and Judah joined Saul in battle when the Philistines tried to invade the central hill country from the southwest in 1 Samuel 17:1. Saul obviously exerted some political influence south of Jerusalem in the northern mountains of Judah, preparing the way for the federation of Israel and Judah under David. Archaeology seems to confirm that until about 1000 BCE, the end of Iron Age I, Israelite society was essentially a society of farmers and stock breeders without any truly centralized organization and administration. Recent population estimates set a figure of about 50,000 settled Israelites west of the Jordan at the end of the 11th century BCE. By contrast, Philistine urban civilization was flourishing in the 11th century BCE, as revealed by recent excavations at Ashdod, Tel Garissa, Tel Mikne, biblical Ekron, and Ashkelon. There's a good deal of pathos in all of this. Saul's reign ended in total failure with his tragic death. After the rout on Mount Gilboa, the Israelite revolt against Philistine domination seemed hopeless. Under the leadership of Saul's adversary, David, however, the fight for independence from the Philistines, the whole reason for Saul's kingship, will be taken up once again, as we shall see, for better or for worse. The king is dead. Long live David.